Now we talk to poet, percussionist, composer, educationalist and animator Eugene Skeef who joins us in the studio. So I suppose for me that's also the very interesting aspect of this festival, the fact that there are so many dimensions of artistry that are involved. Is this why this festival is so popular?
Yes, that's one of the reasons it's popular. But I think an even deeper reason that this festival is popular is that it's based in South Africa, on the continent of Africa, which is the continent that is the source of all creativity and knowledge and wisdom. And poetry is the original language of the gods, the language of nature, and in Africa it is the language that unveils the mystery behind every living and pulsing aspect of creation and life.
And of course poetry in itself also very complex, the different styles, the methods in which it's delivered, and I mentioned about 20 countries and a lot of notables, honorary poets who are going to be on the lineup. Tell us a little bit more about some of their works and why it's important to also particularly bring this to the South African audience.
Even as I say, poetry is a uniform, universal form, and it's a tool that humans use to, take us to a higher level of our being. But every country, every continent, but looking at Africa, as a unified continent, every country in Africa has a different slant on poetry, even though we are all Africans and our source is one. So the variety is what also makes it very exciting. It's a very spiceful festival. So you'll be getting words, you'll be getting styles from all over the continent, just like you have different styles of music, different styles of art. We have different approaches to poetry.
Yeah. And you have been named featured poet for this year. I understand. Tell us a little bit more about the significance of that, and then we'll get into your work, because I believe you're also involved in conflict resolution that also uses various mediums to carry this objective out.
Well, first of all, I'm grateful to Poetry Africa for inviting me as the featured poet for this year's Poetry Africa Festival. And I think what is possibly interesting and unique about myself is that I have a long background of using poetry in the struggle. I worked with Steve Biko and other colleagues from the Black Consciousness movement. I started writing poetry at a very early age, and at that very early age, I started reading it at a very early age. I discovered the power of poetry as a tool for inspiring people to find the truth about themselves more than what is imposed on them in terms of their identity. So Poetry Africa realizes that skill in me, and I guess they're looking forward to me inspiring especially young people, not exclusively young people, but young people in particular, to regain their sense of self and intensify their consciousness of who they really are.
And that's also interesting, because as you say, you are featuring artists from different parts of the world, hemispheres, from also divergent, contesting, competing ideologies. So if you talk to me about Battle of the Wordsmiths, for instance, use that as an example of how you bring people together with that dissonance to create a sense of harmony and beauty.
Like I said earlier, there are commonalities, even though there are differences. The differences are minor compared to our commonalities. And so when I was involved in working with a Nigerian writer, Tunde Olatunji, in creating the Battle of the Wordsmiths, we brought all the art forms together, because again, the distinction between poetry, music, movement, sculpture is a Western compartmentalized notion.
Absolutely.
In Africa, all the art forms are braided. In fact, so in Battle of the Wordsmiths, we brought all those art forms together and put them on stage, and that attracted audiences right across the spectrum because there was something for everybody.
And it's interesting because when you talk about that, I often find that if you talk about spoken word competitions, there's a certain Americanization, inflection with how it's presented. So just looking at through the years, through the generations, and it's coming together and melding, how has that shown up? You're having a slam jam competition, for instance, and I'm just wondering how you fuse it all together so that it's still current, it's relevant.
Well, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. It's a kind of coming home, really, because whether you're into hip hop, whether you do rap, spoken word, whatever your form of verbal or word expression is, the root of it is here, in Africa. In fact, the title of this year's festival is Vote for Poetry More Than Words. And the spoken word poet in days of old was called imbongi, and still now, in our traditional, in the traditional parts of our country. So imbongi is one who sings the praises, and normally they have a royal patron, But there's an interesting thing about imbongi. Whereas normally you'd think that they are beholden to the patron, but we have an expression in isiZulu, in the Zulu language, that says "ukuluma upepete," which is to bite and soothe.
Yes.
So if the patron on whom the poet, the imbongi, relies on, goes a little off track, and is untoward in their behavior, the mbongi, the so-called praise poet, will find a way of criticizing them without losing.
My technical director is going to be angry with me, but I have to ask this question because it's a very interesting thing that you talk about in contemporary politics. For instance, if you talk about the societal role of somebody like Imbongi, what would have then past medieval times would have been a court jester, delivering of important messages and wisdom, and how we use young people in society to do that, especially for political conscientization, for social upliftment.
You're saying, how do we use...
yes, like festivals like this, how do we bring that forth? Because as you say, the role would be seen in one way when it's actually much deeper, it's richer.
Yeah. Well, in fact, again, that's a very beautiful question, and it's on point, because my work, my role as the featured poet is I wear two hats in this thing. I'm a poet, but I'm also a professor of practice at the Center for Education, Education Rights and Transformation at the University of Johannesburg, the Faculty of Education. And wearing those two hats, my role is to motivate young people, especially, to actually believe in themselves more and know that they are actually the embodiment of where we are going, the embodiment of our future. So our role is to inspire young people to take the baton and have confidence in leading,
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Eugene Skeef is a poet, percussionist, composer, educationalist, and animator, and he speaks to us about the festival, which is, I believe, underway at the moment.